All right, so shall we start? Thank you for
Sure.
joining us, Dr. Alexia. Right, so welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to today's ICEC Rising Professionals online session. We have participants from all over the world who will be watching this later on YouTube or other platforms. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Aaron Wong, ICEC Rising Professionals Chair, and is the moderator for today's session. A quick introduction of ICEC Rising Professionals. ICEC Rising Professionals serves as a platform for ICEC association members. They are 40 and under to come together to connect in order to exchange professional knowledge, learn different practices, and serve as a networking program. We will post our social media IDs here on the chat so you can follow us. And a little bit explanation on today's flow. Once the introduction is done, I'll hand it over to Dr. Alexia, who will be speaking for 30 to 40 minutes. And after that, we have 10 minutes of Q&A. Oh, let me switch on my screen first. Oh, what is this? Oh, okay. All right, never mind. I still have to figure out my new tablet. So sharing my screen is not happening at the moment. So I'll have a quick introduction of Dr. Alexia. Oops, wrong. Right. Okay, Dr. Alexia Wolinek has over 25 years of experience in audit and evaluation, systemic risk, estimating, and cost management. Alexia is a fellow of RICS Americas, AACE International, the Guild of Project Controls, and ICEC. She is a past president of AACE International and a past chair of ICEC. She has published a new book, Project Cost Recording and Reporting, so be sure to check it out. More information can be found at www.pellucidprojects.com. I'll have it typed on the chat group in a short while. So let us welcome Dr. Alexia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. How many Rising Professionals presentations have you had so far?
We have had around 7 or 8 over the past 1 year. Yeah, I think this is the first one we are doing this.
Please add me to the distribution list when you send the invite.
Okay, sure, definitely,
yeah,
sure.
I'm happy to
written down.
happy to listen in. So thank you for having me, and I'm going to share my screen. Am I sharing my screen? Okay, hang on, let's see. Files, maybe. No. Well, this is fun. Okay, desktop, there we go.
Right, yep.
And so I believe here we have a PowerPoint presentation. And we can start the slideshow. So a little bit about me. I was ISEC chair at one point, also president of AACE. And I am, my usual role is in project controls or quantity surveying. I started my career as an estimator and then moved into management consulting and then into auditing. And whoops, go back. Or not, it doesn't wish to go back. Okay, fine. So I moved into auditing and then started my own firm, still doing mostly auditing and consulting. And then last year I moved to Virginia and I have now moved back to estimating. So my world has come full circle. I am chief estimator at National Radio Astronomy Observatory, which if I can, there's a button. If I can go back, you can see down here at the bottom of the screen, the NRAO logo, which is National Radio Astronomy Observatory, and we run multiple telescopes, including the ALMA telescope in Chile and the Very Large Array. And we also have a very close relationship and formerly used to manage the Green Bank Observatory, which is one of the oldest observatories and most important in the United States. NRAO is managed by Associated Universities International, and we are funded by the United States National Science Foundation. So, so here I am now. Also, a short story. When I was in college, I studied physics, and I came home very excited after two years studying physics, and I informed my parents that I wanted to study astronomy. And my parents immediately panicked and told me I would never make any money in astronomy and I should study engineering instead. So I finished my physics degree and got my master's in engineering and then a PhD later. And now here I am 30 years after that, and I am working in astronomy. So there. So which my father finds endlessly entertaining, and I'm sure my mom would have found endlessly entertaining if she were still alive. Now, several years ago, I published another book, which was on project performance reviews. And last year, I was approached by Nigel Williams from the University of Portsmouth, asking me if I would be willing to work with him to develop an audit method for societal value. So I agreed to do that. And then started working at NRAO, and we realized that we wanted to study societal value for capital projects, for construction projects, but and we will be working with the Major Projects Association in the UK. However, it is harder to measure the benefits of construction projects in a major city than it is to measure the value brought to the community of construction projects in the middle of nowhere. And the benefit of observatories is that they are built in the middle of nowhere. So, so we have published now one paper, which is largely qualitative. We're working on our second paper. We are also expanding from the original population of radio astronomy observatories to include other observatories and also space science, such as Equatorial Launch Australia and JPL and NASA in the United States. So if we look at societal value and we talk about projects, and usually when we talk about societal value in projects, the conversation is around the value generated by the science, the education opportunities provided through the project, and the financial metrics, which are, those are okay, those have been the traditional metrics, but really there is so much more in societal value that is generated by projects, and that's what we're trying to capture. So we're looking at, we're using the, to some degree, the UN measures for sustainability, which includes societal value. And also environmental sustainability. And Dr. Nigel Williams at University of Portsmouth is a leader in the responsible project management sort of movement. So the concepts that in project management, we have a duty not just to the companies we work for, and also to the project that we're working on, but also to society and the environment, and we have an ethical obligation. So I can put that link in the chat maybe later, or I can email it to you for distribution on a responsible project management. So here's an example of what I'm talking about when I talk about telescopes and observatories. To the left, we have the Arecibo telescope, which collapsed earlier this year, actually late last year, sorry. And that was built in 1963. The expected lifetime for telescopes and observatories is typically 25 years, at which point the technology starts to become, in fact, the technology starts to become obsolete almost immediately. But after 25 years, it becomes really obsolete. So in order to keep these telescopes and observatories running, there's a constant process of adding new technology and equipment to keep them functioning. And as a result, they tend to last much longer than their expected life of 25 years. So the Arecibo telescope lasted over 50 years, which is double its expected life. So the old style of telescopes and the trends with telescopes, they started at a couple meters wide, and then the goal was to build bigger and bigger and bigger telescopes. But now it is not feasible to build the telescope size is too big to be just one dish. So now what we do, starting in the 80s and maybe a bit before, is to put up many antennas, and those antennas are spread out over a large area. Together, those antennas make one telescope. So the Very Large Array in New Mexico was built in 1980, and the Square Kilometer Array in South Africa is currently being built. You can see the differences in sophistication in the equipment. Some are more sophisticated than others, and they each satisfy different research objectives. So it is fairly rare for observatories around the world to duplicate the functionality of another observatory. And the community is very altruistic and giving. The concept is that if you have a research idea, whether you are with a company or a university, or you are just Joe down the street, if you have a valid research proposal, observatories around the world will generally allow you telescope time to test that proposal or test that research. So radio astronomy telescopes are often located in extremely remote places for many reasons, depending on the sort of telescope. So radio astronomy is very sensitive to different kinds of radio waves and wireless and interference. Whereas if you look at optical telescopes, they are very sensitive to light and the glow that we get from cities. So all sorts of telescopes are typically located in extremely remote places that can be have a lot of indigenous people, a lot of native flora and fauna, sort of untouched by the outside world, often extremely economically challenged locations as well, that might not have a lot of the infrastructure that you expect to see in a city or a small town. Now, so when we build these observatories, we install not just the telescopes or antennas, but we also build facilities for research space, offices, create a fire department, a visitor center. There's a lot of civil infrastructure, such as roads and electricity and sewerage and plumbing and data fiber. And then also, of course, we bring in all these scientists who often bring their families. So all of a sudden, in a very remote area, there is all this infrastructure, all this building, very educated individuals who have high expectations of education and healthcare and fire safety and police services. And they last, as I said, these observatories function for up to 50 years or even longer. So there's the immediate effect of building, and then there's the long-term effect of these facilities existing and then these communities developing. So we're going to get into some of that. Here again are some more examples. The Very Large Array is, this is one of my favorite pictures, the one with the snow. It does snow in New Mexico, believe it or not. And the Very Large Array is on rail tracks. It has, I believe, 4 configurations, A, B, C, and D, and these gigantic antennas can be moved around on these tracks to change the configurations. You look at SKA Australia, that one is fixed. Our SIBO, this thing in the middle, is the glowing equipment that's above the dish. That is fixed. Alma moves around their antennas on these giant equipment movers, and then GRTO is a new observatory in Ghana, which is just at the moment one telescope, one antenna, but I believe they are building more. So the reason this is my favorite photo of the Very Large Array is because it does snow in New Mexico, and there are a large number of antennas, and they catch the snow. So there is a actual 3 or 4 step process when it snows, one of which is to tilt the antennas directly vertically, what they call the snow dump position, so they can dump out the snow. And then they can position the antennas so they're pointing at the sun, or they are positioned so people can actually climb into the antennas and sweep out the snow. So it's, to me, a fascinating example of how these are maintained and how the antennas weather the elements. Our first paper interviewed 20 radio astronomy professionals across the world. And we used text coding and visual mapping to pull out the qualitative themes. Because we were focusing on societal value, we focused not just on value creation, but also value destroyed. So there are examples where value is destroyed. If you look in certain communities where there's farming and the land is now being used for assembling these antennas and putting these in place, sometimes there's loss of income or loss of revenue. There could be property damage. If you look at some observatory relationships around the world, sometimes they've gotten off track and had a negative impact on their stakeholders. So we try to be very aware of our impact on stakeholders and work closely with them, especially with native or indigenous populations. And very often what happens is that the value destruction does occur, but then in the course of overcoming that value destruction, there is even more value created that tends to offset the value destruction. So one example, I believe it was in South Africa, where farmers could no longer use that land for grazing. The farmers were provided with education in how to start businesses and run businesses. And now there are a series of feedlots that are used for feeding primarily, I think it's sheep and cattle, I'm not sure. And so now these farmers have gone from just having a farm and letting cattle graze to owning a business where they have a definite sort of cash flow, and they are much more skilled now in managing their businesses and organizations. They're providing jobs to other people for the feedlots. So it's fascinating to see that where value is destroyed, how people and the organizations come up with creative solutions to that end up creating a lot more in terms of opportunities and jobs and businesses. So the typical categories of value, as I mentioned, are STEM education. So that's science, technology, and education, and engineering education, job and business creation, financial records, and commercial and technical products are the typical ways of measuring societal value in capital and engineering projects. Observatory and telescope projects tend to produce a lot of commercial and technical products that you might not think of. because we are constantly adding equipment to these antennas to try to make them do more. So if you have Wi-Fi, if you have wireless technology, you can thank the radio astronomy world for that. Wi-Fi was a technology developed to enable radio astronomy research. If you are using very small chips in your computers, some of that might be attributable to radio astronomy products. So there's a lot of engineering, a lot of design, a lot of creation of tiny bits and bobs that can be attributed to radio astronomy and the development of antennas and telescopes. But in addition, we identified capital and infrastructure improvements, environmental impact, research opportunities, and even COVID-19 emergency response from observatories that count as societal value. So let's talk about STEM career paths. Everybody talks about STEM education in terms of science projects, but what we saw was that because these antennas and observatories are around for so many decades, not only do you have students exposed to engineering education and science, but they become interested in it. They get college degrees in it, they get graduate degrees, they get PhDs, and then very often they come back home to their rural area where they provide, they fill the jobs in education at the K through 12 level and college and graduate school. So they become school teachers, professors, but at some point over many decades, they've filled all the education jobs. So now you have a highly educated local population that has returned home to be with their families, and they're looking for jobs, and there are no more education jobs available. The observatories do tend to hire these individuals who have come back home, who are part of the local population. But also we're starting to see relationships with major industries such as telecommunications, where jobs are becoming available in engineering and science that aren't necessarily in education and aren't necessarily just at the observatory. So we're looking at a decades-long repeating cycle of growth that I think is more complex than what you usually think of when you think of STEM education. In terms of economic impact, there is a short-term impact during the construction phase, where trade skills are developed within the local population, short-term jobs are available. And then obviously during operations, there are long-term jobs, there is workforce development of people who work at the observatory. And their money tends to go back into the local economy. So the place where you live tends to be where you spend your money. But also during operations, there are opportunities for businesses to be created. So there's a supply and value chain that is created that again leads to more local spending. So companies that can provide food services and food supply, companies that can provide tools and small equipment and maintenance labor and housekeeping services and supplies, things like this. And then there's this third element of observatories, which is astrotourism, which can be absolutely huge. So there's often a visitor center developed at or near an observatory, depending on what kind of interference there is and how the observatory is structured. If you look at the Alma Observatory in Chile, it is at an extreme elevation. So the visitor center is actually much farther down the mountain at a less extreme elevation, along with some of the other buildings. And there are actually fairly few people up at the extreme height. But along with tourism and the visitor center come hotels and restaurants, crafts shops and arts. And again, a lot of local business growth and local spending. So it's again, much more dynamic than if you think of just the economic impact of operating an office and a few antennas. The mere existence of the facilities also creates research opportunities that you might not think of when you think of a radio astronomy telescope. So in a remote area, because there are offices and scientists and very often antennas that can both send and receive different kinds of information, this enables a lot of GPS and satellite related research, which can include oceanography, study of fishing, atmospheric studies, land surveying. In fact, I think it's in Ghana, they're identifying illegal land use because they're able to capture that land surveying information. I mentioned the technical products developed through engineering, but also there is so much data generated by the antennas at this point that it has been described as drinking from a fire hose of data. It's just, there's so much of it. And as a result, the populations of data and numbers and information are instrumental to graduate students in studying data science and machine learning, simply because there are just these huge volumes of data out there. And so it's a fun population to play with. And also the data science and machine learning applications that are developed can then be applied in radio astronomy for scientist use. There's a lot of heritage studies that are enabled, such as archaeology and paleontology, local culture. And in addition, when we're talking about indigenous peoples or native land and historic landowners, there's also archaeoastronomy. These populations studied astronomy long before modern man did, with very different techniques. And so when we talk about ALMA in Chile and the Very Large Array in New Mexico, there's actually a partnership between the two observatories where they send students from Chile to the United States and students from the US to Chile. If you could please turn off your microphone if you're listening, thank you. And comparing archaeoastronomy with current astronomy practices and science, and showing how they intersect, which is absolutely fascinating. There are also, because of the very large swaths of land, many, many square miles needed for these installations of many antennas, there's an opportunity to study biodiversity and natural resources and try to have an impact with endangered species. So here's an example of the sort of installations that occurred during construction. You can see on the left, fiber being run in South Africa, the Arecibo electronics being installed, that's the black and white photo, foundations being poured for ALMA in Chile, and the rail lines for the Very Large Array on which the antennas are moved back and forth. The services provided, I've mentioned some of these already, but power, roads, sewerage, rural services tend to come first. Then we have food supply, healthcare, transportation, bus transportation and rail transportation back and forth from the nearest local city to where these antennas are installed. And then housing also is developed to house not just the people at the facility, but also all the local workers and all the people who are moving to the area to create businesses and support the facility. And then community enhancements. So you start seeing a lot of infrastructure popping up, more schools, community college, community learning centers, trade schools, libraries, computer centers, all this ends up being developed in an area that once had very little infrastructure at all, typically. So on the left, we have the ALMA residences in Chile. We have a warehouse where one of the antennas was being assembled at the Very Large Array. And on the right-hand side, also the operations center for ALMA. So when you think of observatories, you might not think of large complexes like this, but they do exist. There's much more out there than just telescopes and antennas. In Australia and in South Africa, we're seeing reintroduction of wildlife, removal of invasive species, and the development of species to introduce as biocontrol. So there's a natural balance in the environment where certain species keep others in check. And so there are, I believe, beetles being developed that can eat some of the invasive fungus that are on trees and things like this. It's really fascinating. In South Africa, the area that's being occupied by the antennas requires radio frequency silence in order to minimize interference from the outside. And as a result, they have created a national nature reserve, which will be a protected natural area and an opportunity for environmental studies. There are, let's see, I've mentioned some of the site-specific impacts already. I think I covered all of this. So to bring this to a very fast close, our next steps, we're continuing to study this. We're adding more observatories. I think the first, we presented our first poster at the American Astronomical Society. And 1 week later, we presented at IEEE TEMS conference, which is Technology and Engineering Management. And we presented that in Germany. In the week between the poster and the paper presentations, we had 5 citation requests. So this paper has been extremely well received. It's being shared all over the place. And a huge benefit of it is that all the observatories we called the first time around who wouldn't return our calls, they're now all calling us to participate. So our participation is increasing, and we're expanding to include space science as well. So we're going to continue to study all this and then eventually expand to other construction project types. Although frankly, we could probably write 5 more papers just on radio astronomy. And our own, with myself at National Radio Astronomy Observatory at NRAO, I've managed to draw the attention of sort of the original generation of scientists and engineers who developed the Very Large Array. So I'm talking to all these guys who have so much history, and they're also extremely excited to talk about this, because it's usually we're so focused on the science. That's our world. I have definitely come full circle in my career and landed in a place with the nerdiest of the nerds and the smartest people in the room. So I have found my people, and they're a lot of fun to work with. It's a very very special place to work with a very strong sense of community. And now that we are all vaccinated and starting to open up our offices again, I look forward next month to traveling to Green Bank Observatory, which is maybe a half day's drive from where I live right now, and spending some time there. And then in September, I will be spending 2 or 3 weeks in New Mexico. So you might see on social media some photos of me climbing up on antennas and things like this. One thing we did learn also from our research is that societal value, the measurement of it is sometimes a bit of an afterthought, because we are so very focused on the science. And so we would like to see, in an ideal world, funding provided for projects so that societal value can continue to be studied. Nigel and I have done all of this for free without funding. And I am very, very fortunate that NRAO and AUI have supported me in this. So they haven't minded that I take some work hours to do interviews and study this. But I can honestly say, I think it's the first time in my career that an employer has truly supported my research. We need also to create a uniform, consistent global language and a way of studying societal value. Right now, there are many different approaches to it, but not really any consistency. It's kind of like studying best practices or developing metrics for project success, right? Each one's a little bit different, and each organization captures information that is relevant to them and relevant to their funding sources and organizations. So each organization is a little bit different in the information they capture. It would be nice to see a little bit more uniformity there. Eventually, we will be developing an audit methodology for a societal value framework for construction projects. But as you can see, we have just spent a year studying only radio astronomy. And now we're going to spend the next year continuing with that and adding space science and launch sites. So it's going to be a little while for us to study many different construction project types to develop a methodology. But in the meantime, we can work towards developing an audit methodology specific to radio astronomy. It is a trending topic right now in the radio astronomy field, and there is a lot of interest. I have been told by multiple observatories that as soon as we have a methodology, they want to use it. So it's pretty exciting. So what's next in terms of radio astronomy? Well, as I said, these facilities are getting bigger and bigger. So the project that I am working on right now, the project for which I am chief estimator, which is managed by AUI and funded by the US National Science Foundation, is called the Next Generation Very Large Array. You can see on this photo at the top, this map, the majority of the antennas will be centered in New Mexico, close to the Very Large Array. But also, there will be antennas across the entire continental and non-continental United States, including New York. We're looking at New York, Washington State, and a whole bunch of different locations. This will be the installation of over 280 antennas, which will all talk to each other, and together those 280 antennas make one telescope. So that is the scope and scale of new radio astronomy projects. This project is expected to be in the construction cost range of $2 billion. So let's see, I should mention an extremely sincere thank you to everybody who contributed to this research. We have bothered and taken valuable time from so many astrophysicists and scientists and engineers around the world who fortunately are extremely enthusiastic about this kind of stuff. So we are absolutely indebted to them for their time and for their participation and for their ongoing participation as well. So let's see, I am going to stop sharing my screen so you can look at me. I'm looking at the questions here. I don't see questions come up yet, but I am happy to answer some questions. I apologize for covering so much in such a short time. Believe it or not, this at 20 slides is the short version of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alexia. That was a very interesting talk. Wow, all of the satellites combined together to be a telescope. That's really amazing. I find the exchange of data and knowledge very fascinating. And we're just talking about in the United States, and I can only imagine if the whole world can work together, and we will have a better value of understanding these construction projects and how it can contribute to a lot to.
Yes, and if you look at the square kilometer array and Soreo, that is South Africa and Australia working together to build all the antennas that together make one telescope. So that's an example of global cooperation. And if you look at the European Southern Observatories Organization, even though they're located in Europe, we're talking about scientists and governments that all contribute to these projects. So the Very Large Array and the Next Generation Very Large Array are not funded only by the United States. They are funded by multiple countries who contribute labor and equipment and engineering and the science to developing these observatories and then participating in the research. So the list of countries for the Next Generation Very Large Array is not necessarily final yet. But if you look at the Very Large Array, if you look at ALMA, you look at the European Southern Observatories, we see participation from China and Japan, the Netherlands, France, the UK, Chile, Puerto Rico, which is part of the US, Ghana, South Africa, Australia. There are so many countries that participate in these. It's really much more than just a national effort. That said, if you look at countries such as Ghana, the development of an observatory is much more than just a scientific effort. It's a nation building effort. It's that development of science and that influx of technology really is instrumental for developing countries. And of course, because these observatories are typically located in remote areas, we're going to see more and more of this in developing countries.
Right. Thank you for that. I'd like to reach out to our participants. Anyone has a question for Dr. Alexia? You can raise your hands and we'll meet you. You can, and just perhaps while we're waiting for that, I have a little question of mine. What are the common misconceptions from the local community with regards to this radio astronomy projects? Are they very reluctant or are they very willing?
It depends. It's part of this is really a stakeholder management and stakeholder engagement effort. So just yesterday, I was speaking with the Equatorial Launch Australia, which is just beginning their project, and they emphasize that they have so much to learn from the local community. It's not just a one-way flow of information. Mm-hmm. And I think in the past, if you look maybe in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, there was a tendency to acquire the land for some of these installations. And now it's much more typical to have long-term lease or land use agreements and much stronger engagement with the local community, much more involvement from the local community. And so, but keep in mind, because we're very often building in areas where there are indigenous and populations that go back, sort of 60,000 years, these are archaeological sites. So we need to have extreme sensitivity to the archaeological sites as well.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Alexia. Do we have any questions from the participants?
Hi, Dr. Alexia. Jacqueline here from Singapore. So I think first of all, really thank you so much for sharing with us an interesting topic. So actually personally, I'm also part of the ICEC committee. So actually I remember that time when Aaron shared with us, you have 2 papers. I think we voted for this. I actually voted for this topic because personally, I actually quite interested on and then because actually for Singapore is it's actually linked to the question that I want to ask you. Because actually for Singapore is a very small and dense populated city. So I think from your sharing, you mentioned that actually most of these radio astronomy projects actually built in a remote, like a rural place. So I'm not sure actually, like, for example, giving a context like for Singapore or maybe for Hong Kong, are there any possible that actually we can have this kind of astronomy project in a dense, is a more populated area? So this is my first question. Then secondly is I'm not sure about are there any concern about the health impact? Because like when we heard about the radio astronomy, I think first thing maybe we think about like radiation or certain thing. Are there any like any scientific or maybe any health impact to the person actually living nearby, or maybe for the person now, like for yourself, you need to actually deal with the project like daily? Yeah. Thank you.
So let's see, those are two very different questions. One is in terms of living in a big city and having the possibility of these observatories being built. It's highly unlikely, but if you look at Singapore and Hong Kong and sort of the geography of this part of the world, you have a lot of islands that are very remote. It is perhaps not inconceivable that you could build or site an antenna on a remote island. That's actually entirely possible. It's just a matter of you can't just drop an antenna somewhere. So the one thing is that the antennas are very, very sensitive to moisture and also to temperature. So hot and wet is maybe not a good combination. They tend to be built in areas that are dry and much more temperate or cold even. Because these the electronics are extremely sensitive to vibrations and at a molecular level, really. Some of the equipment is actually chilled down to sub-freezing temperatures. So we tend to prefer cold locations and dry. So Hong Kong or Singapore, maybe not the best choice.
Yeah, we are hot and humid.
Right, yeah. So I will say I'm terribly sorry we did not make it to we weren't able to hold PAX in Singapore. I was heartbroken. I was very much looking forward to going, but anyway. So in terms of perhaps danger or health effects to people who are doing the research, the antennas just receive, the antennas are capable of detecting radio transmission frequencies that you and I experience every single day. We just don't detect them ourselves. So it's no more dangerous to them than it is to you or I or anybody else. Those frequency transmissions from space exist everywhere.
Do the satellites function like receiving from
It depends on the type of antenna. So
okay.
there are some antennas that receive and others that transmit. Okay. The radar technology tends to be a completely different type of science, and it's also the radar capabilities are often used for global and Earth defense. So you see different sorts of organizations using different technology. But I think the majority is really the study of what's incoming. The Arecibo telescope in Puerto Rico was famous for being the telescope that that transmitted the sort of famous message to outer space of "we are human" and here's the number pi and all this other stuff. So they also have a really cool website and store of stuff you can buy. So if you want to buy a picture of that message, you can do it. It's super cool. They have a good, I bought a t-shirt for my dad this year. And then let's see, Green Bank has a huge amount of history. And let's see, the telescopes also tend to be featured in movies sometimes as, but just because it did just super cool installations, right? And very high tech. So Arecibo was in one of the James Bond movies. It was a secret scientist lair in one of the James Bond movies. And the Very Large Array was featured in the Jodie Foster movie Contact. So if you want to watch that, you'll see the Very Large Array and this concept of receiving information from outer space and making contact. So definitely the first question everybody asks is whether or not we have heard from anybody outside of Earth. I have a personal opinion about that. I think they've come, they took one look at us and they left, and then they put us on sort of a no-fly zone. But yeah, well, these guys are a disaster. No, not coming back there. But it's perhaps very egotistical and conceited of us to think that we are the only life in the universe.
Right. I think the next time we meet, I think we can have a long conversation on this topic, whether we have what's out there. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Absolutely, yes.
I have just one more question. For astronomical, for these kind of projects, radio astronomy projects, they're normally very, very huge. And are they normally decommissioned in the same way as a normal building projects would? Would their parts be reused, and would it still be capable for other this kind of projects?
Yes. So decommissioning, it's funny, we were just talking about whether or not we would be decommissioning the Very Large Array when we're building the next generation Very Large Array. And so yes, there's definitely, some of these parts are pretty expensive, and some of them, because we are constantly upgrading, are pretty new. So yes, you can reuse the materials. It's also really fascinating if you look at the Square Kilometre Array, SAREO now, they've renamed themselves, in South Africa. The some of the antennas, as you saw, were very, very low tech. And they were just wood and steel with some electronics. And so all of those materials are being recycled and reused. I have heard that some of them are being made into coffee tables, and I really want one. So I need to have this discussion with somebody. But yes, they are definitely recycled and reused. I think the Arecibo telescope, the electronics that you saw that is hanging high above, that's much more able to be to find new uses than the dish. I think the dish has been pretty much destroyed. So there's a demolition effort going on, and there's a lot of steel that can be recycled there, I think.
Thank you very much, Dr.
It's interesting when you look at these projects. I mean, one of the Green Bank Observatory telescopes had a very famous collapse quite a long time ago. I think it was in the 70s or earlier, maybe. No, the photos looked like the 70s. At least the fashions looked like the 70s. And so you note that because we're constantly increasing the technology and the engineering, that's not the part that fails. It's the structure that reaches an end of its life. So it's the steel that sort of rusts and fails first, rather than the technology. But if you want to Google Green Bank telescope collapse, it was pretty spectacular. Apparently you could hear it starting to collapse, and then everybody went running out of the building. Nobody was hurt, I don't think. And Arecibo, it was known for several years that Arecibo was beginning to fail.
Yeah, thank you very much for answering those questions. Does anyone have more questions that you have for Dr. Alexia? That has been a very great night.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It is, even though my core job is estimating and cost, right? And we're putting together this huge project of all these antennas, and these projects take decades and decades to happen, right? They're conceived 20 years before, and then there's the design of the sort of new antenna, and then talking to vendors, and then finding somebody who can build 280 of this, and it's going to take many years to build 280, right? And then installing them and getting it all up and running and talking to each other. These projects take many decades to put in place. So I am sincerely hoping this is the last project of my career. I think I think by the time it is up and running, I will be at retirement age. But NRAO has a history of keeping people much longer beyond retirement age. We have a bunch of 80-year-olds who are still at the top of their profession and raising a ruckus.
Wow.
So I look forward to staying engaged for the rest of my life, I hope.
Dream come true, I hope.
Yeah, I found my people.
Mm.
When I was 18, I wanted to study astronomy, and here I am. I'm not studying it, but I'm definitely completely immersed.
Right. If there are no other questions, talk. Well, thank you very much once again for having the talk with us, Dr. Alexia. We look forward to seeing you again for our future talks. We'll definitely invite you again. That was a very interesting talk, and I look forward to meeting you in person to talk about what's out there, X-Files.
Absolutely, yes. And so if you are attending the PAX conference in the Philippines or online, I will be doing this presentation again for them. So if you didn't catch all of it, you can do that. Also, I have sent you a copy of the paper and a copy of the presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Excellent. Right. Well, thank you
all. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, all participants. Have a good night, have a good afternoon, have a good morning.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alexia.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.
Hello. Hello. Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes.
I am so sorry. I came late. I was having some serious issues with my internet, and by the time it was settled, the program was almost done. So I heard the last part of what she